everybody, welcome back to You Can't Win. This is Tom here. I'm joined by Donald as usual, and returning guest, Professor Pizzagate Mike.
Evening, gents.
Yeah, so today we are going to be continuing our coverage of Pizzagate and Epstein and all that good stuff. We're going to follow up on some of our ideas that we had last time, and there's going to be a lot of information on this episode. We've really done our research here and put together some notes. A lot of this is based on the series of articles that Whitney Webb has published up on Mint Press News, which I would urge anybody who's interested in this kind of stuff to go read. They are the most coherent and lucid explanations of why any of this stuff matters and the best way to make sense of it. So we've gone ahead and gone through these articles. They're fairly long and information dense, so we've gone through them with a fine-tooth comb. We've picked through the sources that she's cited and put together a history of mob involvement with the government and how these blackmail operations started and how they've been used throughout the 20th century, what they might look like today, and essentially, we've put together a look at what power structures might look like in 2019 based on this particular angle of things. It's going to be interesting if you guys are ready. So I think a good place to start here will be the early 20th century, actually the late 19th century, when a family called the Bronfmans first emigrated from Russia, escaping pogroms. They went to Manitoba, Canada, and they purchased some hotels in the prairie lands there. They came as horse traders. They weren't involved in anything illegal. They weren't even involved in anything to do with liquor or anything, which they later became famous for, which is sort of ironic because their name's Bronfman, and that means brandy man in Yiddish, I guess. So yeah, they bought these hotels, and they quickly realized that they were not going to be able to stay afloat by just the hotels themselves, but really what was keeping them afloat was the bars in the hotel.
Mm-hmm.
That all came to a halt in 1915 when Canada had its prohibition. So Canada's prohibition, as Donald and Mike are well aware, came prior to the American prohibition and lasted a much shorter time. And it was also a little bit more patchwork in terms of the legal structures that involved, like you could sell from province to province and stuff. So you could kind of find loopholes and ways around it. So this is what the Bronfmans did. Because the laws allowed sale from one province to the other, and all the provinces had different laws, they were able to operate a mail order business where they shipped whiskey by rail across the country. And then later this was also banned, but then they started to rebrand their liquor as medicine. So they had things that they called the Rockabye cough cure and liver and kidney cure and stuff like that. So, you know, they really kind of got invested in liquor as their business of choice, right? And they made a fair penny doing this. In 1919, the Volstead Act outlawed the production and consumption of liquor in the United States. But Canada did not ban the export of liquor to the U.S. And this seems to be because they taxed the sale of liquor quite heavily, as people tend to do. And so that was a nice source of income that they didn't want to lose. So the Bronfmans this was great for them because now they had the entire American market. They had this nationwide thing in Canada. Now they could set it up so they could start selling to the United States, and that would actually be legal too. The only problem is that once it gets to the US, it's not legal to be consuming that, so that needs to be done through illegal means. And here's a quote from Sam Bronfman, who is kind of the patriarch of the family at this time. He said, "We were late starters in the two most lucrative markets, on the high seas and across the Detroit River. What came out of the border trade in Saskatchewan was insignificant by comparison." So this was like a big boon for him. This is like really where he starts to make like a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, they needed to make contacts with organized crime in the major markets in the U.S. Mm-hmm. So he did that. And I mean, he cultivated ties with people who are infamous. Lucky Luciano, Mo Dalitz, Longies Willman, Mayor Lansky, who we'll talk about later. These were the guys that controlled the markets for liquor in the big cities, and these were the people that they got in contact. However, Bronfman, he didn't like crime, right? He wanted to be like a respectable kind of person, and in contrast to some of the other people we're going to be talking about today, he was kind of like a family man. He had one wife and stayed loyal to that wife throughout his life. he had some kids that he took care of and tried to keep his reputation clean as much as he could.
Mm-hmm.
But the bigger he got off of the liquor business that he ran, the harder that was to do because it was so intimately tied with organized crime. Especially after the murder in 1922 of his partner, Paul Matoff, he liked to keep his distance. So what happened there was it's an unsolved murder, but this was a distributor of his, and it seems like he was delivering a shipment to somebody and got hit with a shotgun blast to the face. So, yeah. Yeah, and what's interesting is that many of the relatively smaller wholesalers that he was working with would go on to become his actual direct distributors after 1933 and the end of Prohibition. So he kind of like established this network with people who were part of this organized crime world and then later would incorporate them into his legal enterprises and stuff. This was all under the brand of Seagram Limited, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with that brand of liquor, Seagram's. They're an interesting company. I looked this up, and they would diversify in the 50s and 60s into oil and gas. And in the 80s, they got into petrochemicals along joint with DuPont. So they worked with DuPont to get into petrochemicals. And then in the 90s, they got into entertainment and communications with MCA and Universal. And MCA will also be an organization that we may talk about later with Reagan and Wasserman and people like that.
Yeah.
Another interesting connection to the recent news with Bronfman's children is that family is a very rich and famous family and powerful family in Canada. They have associated with a lot of the people that are tied to the Epstein case, notably Leslie Wexner. But his granddaughter, Sam's granddaughter, Claire Bronfman, has recently admitted that she held sex slaves and committed credit card fraud for the NXIVM cult. So this was a cult that was operating on the west coast of the United States that was recently like busted up and stuff. So the Bronfmans were even tied to that, which is really interesting.
The NXIVM thing, I honestly don't know how different it is really from the Epstein thing. I mean, you have the same kind of like charismatic psychopath at the center. You have like these female procuresses. You know, a lot of it seems to be elite targeted. So like there is kind of an ideological component, but I mean, it seems to be sort of a similar thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. We'll get into exactly what I think the purpose of this like sordid activity is. I mean, which is essentially blackmail. But I think that you will see a proliferation of different varieties of like cultural manifestations of this because it's targeting different populations and stuff.
Yeah.
And it's just like picking people out from whatever cultural background you may inhabit. You'll be able to get involved in this sort of thing. So as we'll go on, we'll see that a lot of the people involved in these elements of this broader network happen to be Jewish American or Italian American. But I think that it's very likely that there's also like a WASP version of this and like a hippy dippy whatever kind of version, you know, like a progressive type of version or whatever. I'm sure that in Europe, I'm sure there's a whole kind of different variety over there. Like I imagine that there's a small section of any given cultural population that is touched by this kind of stuff.
It's interesting because one of the things that I was thinking about Epstein is that, you know, like Epstein obviously has kind of like a particular taste, I think, in young women. You know, he's kind of inheriting from Cohn, who we'll talk about later, but Cohn is, you know, if not gay, I mean, he's interested primarily in like homosexual sex, right? Homosexual acts. And so most of his blackmail is conducted with boys, right? Or young boys. So there's like a target market, and then there's the question of like who the actual guy at the center has to go and procure the kids, what he's like, right? You know, and these cultural aspects as well.
Yeah, and there's an interesting question there of to what extent this isn't just a job, but this is like a life for them, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll get into that later. I want to get through a little bit more of this.
Sure. Yeah.
Evidence here. So that's Bronfman, right? That's Sam Bronfman. His grandchildren will come up later when we talk about the mega group. But one of the people that worked as a very important middleman for Bronfman's bootlegging operations was a guy called Louis Rosenstiel. So Rosenstiel, his personality was very different from that of Bronfman's. While Bronfman was a guy who sort of reluctantly almost fell into this position as like a mob boss, Rosenstiel is more like your stereotypical mob boss figure in terms of his personality. He was described as loud, opinionated, and domineering. He was described as a hulking figure who favored amber-tinted glasses, which he rarely removed, and large cigars to go with his status as one of the wealthiest men alive. And intelligent, articulate, and extraordinarily aggressive. This is all from a biography of the Bronfmans. He was known to be really harsh and oppressive as a boss to work for, and he also was known to bug his offices so that he would listen in on his employees and hear what they were saying and then confront them about it later. He was known to call people up in the middle of the night and make wild demands of like, okay, you need to go do this now, that kind of stuff. Like he was really very different from Bronfman, right? You can see that. And in contrast to Bronfman's loyalty to his wife and kind of family man persona, Rosenstiel was married 4 or 5 times, was known as a bisexual and fairly promiscuous. He even had a nickname of Rosie. And here we get into the kind of organization of these parties. So Rosenstiel is kind of the guy behind these blackmail parties. Okay, so he organized these things that included J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, and Roy Cohn. We'll talk about both of them later. They would appear at these parties among other wealthy, powerful, influential people. And Rosenstiel at these parties would be wearing a fluffy black dress with flounces and lace stockings, high heels, and a black curly wig. And he had on makeup and false eyelashes. And this is according to his 4th wife. Wow. So it's just, yeah. And you got to think this is in the 30s, the 40s. This is when homosexuality was considered like a really deviant perversion. It wasn't something that you would want to be known as. So if you were caught doing something like this, you were, I mean, that's blackmail material, you know? Mm-hmm. I mentioned Hoover and Roy Cohn in attendance at these parties. Hoover, as I'm sure many people are aware, liked to do very similar things, dress up as a woman and put on makeup. But at these parties, they participated in group sex with young male prostitutes, teenage age. This all came out after a investigation conducted by the New York police. It was found credible by Judge Edward McLaughlin. It was corroborated by separate and unconnected witnesses. So this is all stuff that's pretty much, we have documented evidence of this. This isn't just wild speculation. Mm-hmm. I pulled all this from a biography on Hoover by Anthony Summers. What's interesting here, to tie it back to Epstein, is the fact that you have sordid and socially unacceptable sexual behavior going on at parties with rich and powerful people. It's all being recorded by microphone. And this looks a lot like what may have been going on at Epstein's place that Wexner gifted him, right? They had celebrities and politicians and the elites of society attending parties there. And there was young women there, and there was cameras hooked up in the house. So very similar seeming circumstances.
My understanding is that it seems as though Hoover, like, he knew that he was being recorded by the mob, and he was okay with it. Like
that's what it seems to be. Yeah.
And you know, like, this was just part of his blackmail network. He understood that he was enmeshed in it, and like, he's good with that.
Yeah. Hoover seems to have been both subject to blackmail and controlled by the blackmail, and also using it himself and controlling others with it. He was known to keep secret files on all kinds of people in Washington and elsewhere, and a lot of it was stuff that was created at these parties that Rosenstiel hosted. And later, Roy Cohn would go on to inherit that position as an organizer of these parties. But,
you know, I was laughing at the cross-dressing thing because it seems so out of place. But you know, I wonder if it stops appearing at these parties when it stops being like really transgressive to cross-dress. Like, It just because I don't see that happening anymore, right? At least.
I don't know. That's an interesting point. I came across something here that said that Roy Cohn, one of the witnesses who was at one of these parties, said that he got to the door, Roy Cohn was the person that opened the door for them, and introduced Hoover dressed up as a woman as Mary or something, and like
Right.
could barely keep himself from laughing when he was
Yeah.
doing it. So
Yeah.
it's not like they were like taking themselves super seriously or
No.
something.
Yeah. It's
You
weird.
know,
It's a
it
goofy
is.
in a wig.
Yeah, it's strange. It's really hard to get a handle on to what extent these guys are. I think it's all things, right? Like it's almost like they're being ironic about it, but they're still doing it.
Yeah.
And I think the real motivating factor here that's pushing it all is that they know they're acquiring a measure of power over other people by doing this.
Right.
Yeah, Rosenstiel, like he started off working for Bronfman and would later become like a rival to Bronfman in the liquor industry. So he sort of set off on his own and started his own companies and stuff, and they would later become like dueling titans in the liquor industry. Rosenstiel in particular, while Bronfman liked to kind of keep his distance and really only touched on the mob as much as he had to get started and everything and to keep going with it, Rosenstiel was more like willing to just go pedal to the metal, and he was particularly close to the Jewish American and Italian American mob, which those two mobs actually formed an alliance that was known as the National Criminal Syndicate. So I find that interesting that these two organizations would form like a federal entity, to
Yeah.
kind of work together. That's a pattern that I think continues throughout this history as we go forward. So I also picked up some information just about the mob's general involvement in the government because I wanted to be clear about the kind of things that I'm talking about. So this is particularly the Italian mob, but the earliest time that we see direct involvement of the mob in government is in 1931 when Lucky Luciano sends gunmen to see the co-leader of Manhattan's Second Assembly District, Harry C. Perry, and he asks him to step down in favor of Albert Marinelli, who is like one of his henchmen, and it worked. They got him to take over instead, and in the 40s things got a little more brazen when Frank Costello dispatched gunmen to many clubs around the city to help elect his henchmen as district leaders. And then after that, they started to get a little more sophisticated and a little more subtle. They were taking things like food programs, daycare leases, waterfront developments, urban renewal contracts, and minority enterprise businesses to be opportunities for theft. So I think anyone who's like watched The Sopranos kind of gets the idea here, like no-show job contracts and
Yeah.
stuff like that. And what they really were able to do was get a hold on the real estate in New York. They helped drive up the cost of building in New York, which kind of benefited everyone who owned property because it meant the value of your property was going up. So interesting like alignment of interests there.
I just had a general question about this federations and networks and things. Do you think there were more mutually assured destruction kind of stuff? Like that they had kind of a basis where operations kind of had to work within some sort of logic or else they would get blown up completely? Or do you think in this period that there was people that actually had singular power over entire networks, or at least a few people like Hoover? Like I was interested by some of the stuff you're saying about Hoover. Like I always kind of think like, and is there someone that could actually make decisive decisions, or were there? Do you know what I mean? Like, is it like
Yeah.
total control, or is it just?
I tend to think it's a little bit of both. Like I think that Hoover did have a massive amount of control over things. And that's something that seems to be the case with a lot of these guys is that they do individually wield a lot of power over a lot of people and organizational power. But I think it's also the case that you want these organizations set up in, as you say, like mutually assured destruction type of dynamics, just to ensure that things will keep running. It sort of helps control like a larger herd of people, so you can, what these guys had was they had individuals numbers, but when you wanted to control an organization, I think you needed to do it in this more structural way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So it's not necessarily. I mean, it's a syndicate, but it operates within kind of a chaotic framework kind of thing. It's not like it's It's not
Yeah,
actually
right. It's not like a
administered.
registered,
Yeah.
like, yeah, it's sort of like in the way that the mob itself
Sure.
operates, right? Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of it's funny because, and we'll see this in a second here, that there was a almost military style chain of command that was
Yeah.
very, like, it was outlined very specifically, like with certain terms and a well understood hierarchy. But it's also the case that it's sort of informal too, you
Yeah.
know? Yeah, there is sort of like this dual character to things.
Sure.
Yeah, let me get into Mayor Lansky really quick, and then
Okay.
I'll get back to Hoover. I have a little bit more on Hoover. So, Mayor Lansky is someone who I imagine most people have probably heard of, but he was like the one big mob guy who lived through the 20s, like lived past the 20s, and never actually spent a day in jail. So he was like the guy that managed to survive everything. And I think it comes clear why. So, Bronfman and Rosenstiel both were in touch with Lansky. They threw dinner parties to honor him, and dinner parties becomes sort of a theme here, that the people that come after these folks will also sort of pick up that pattern of behavior. So Bronfman threw these dinner parties during and after the Prohibition and received favors in return from Lansky, which ranged from exclusive protection for his shipments during the Prohibition to things like getting tickets to Fight of the Century boxing matches. By dinner parties, I don't just mean like it's just a typical Sunday dinner. I mean like it's lavish. You know, it's an
Yeah.
elaborate thing. There's a lot of money involved in that. And this kind of goes to what we were talking about, Mike, like how much of this is just enjoying this kind of lifestyle is maybe part of the motivation here, you know?
Sure.
So Rosenstiel also threw dinner parties to honor Lansky, and these are the kinds of dinner parties that had Hoover in attendance as well. And there was suitcases full of photographs of Hoover, Rosenstiel, and Lansky together at these parties that were acquired by the Philadelphia Inquirer. And at one of these parties, Rosenstiel was overheard saying that if the government ever brings pressure against Lansky or any of us, we'll use this party or the evidence of this party as blackmail. So it was always well understood, it seems, that whenever they interacted together, that they were doing, that there was kind of a cover over it, that there was like a protective cover, which was the evidence that it happened. And that they would keep that evidence hidden. And if anyone were to find out, well, they'd all get in trouble, right? It wouldn't be good for anybody. So you all get together and then document it so that no one actually ends up finding out that it happens, which is an interesting kind of irony.
Yeah.
Lansky would refer to Rosenstiel as his supreme commander, which is interesting. That's kind of what I was talking about with the chain of command. And then the inverse, like Rosenstiel would refer to Lansky as field commander. And we'll see this later with a couple other guys using the same terms. And here's an interesting thing about Lansky. So during World War II, the Navy had a problem with waterfront sabotage. What happened was they were trying to ship troops across the Atlantic to Europe to fight the Nazis, right? And what they had done was they retrofitted a cruise ship to carry these U.S. troops. And the ship was sunk in, at the waterfront before it ever set sail. So what the U.S. military intelligence did was they got in touch with the Jewish and Italian mafias, and they used them not only to help break up Bund rallies, especially the Jewish mafia was interested in this, as you might imagine, but these mafias were connected to the longshoremen and all that kind of stuff. They were able to stop entirely any sabotage from occurring after that point. It just completely came to a stop.
Yeah.
So in return for this, the government commuted Lucky Luciano's prison sentence and then deported him to Italy. And also, they didn't do anything to Lansky. So Lansky stayed behind in the U.S. And to me, this seems to be, I mean, I'm not an expert on organized crime history or anything, but I think this is why a lot of the people that seem to be involved in this stuff happen to be Jewish. I think it's the Jewish mafia became the people that were really behind a lot of this gray area, one foot in organized crime and one foot in government or one foot in respectable society.
Right.
So the CIA also worked with Lansky in Cuba. After Castro took over Cuba, there was a lot of properties that were confiscated by the state, and a lot of those they were owned by the mafia, right?
Yeah.
Casinos.
Right.
Lots of
Yeah.
casinos, I think.
Yeah, and probably liquor too, rum and
Mm.
stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So there was just mutual interest there, like the CIA wants to get Castro out because, their guy got taken out, Batista, and they wanted to get the communist out of there, and Lansky feels similarly, right? And we'll kind of see later some more anti-communist connections here too. Lansky was also tied to Mossad. So the Israeli arms procureur and high-ranking Mossad official Tibor Rosenbaum, his bank, International Credit Bank of Geneva, laundered Lansky's money and recycled it back into American businesses. Lansky eventually, I think in the early 70s, settled in Israel and retired there safe and sound. Yeah, the earliest that I have found on Lansky attempting to blackmail powerful people was 1939. The journalist Ed Reed wrote about this, that he was establishing a drug ring in Mexico with the help of the OSS, which was
Mm-hmm.
the precursor to the
Yeah.
CIA. So it's very interesting how far back that goes. That's prior even to Operation Underworld, which was the naval intelligence working with. Yeah, it seems like the intelligence. One thing that Douglas Valentine, who is an author who's written on the CIA and what is it, the Phoenix Project? What is it called, Mike?
Yeah,
You
it's
want?
the Phoenix Project. Yeah.
Yeah, so he's a really good author to read about this kind of stuff. But one thing that I heard him say once was that everything the CIA does is illegal. It's just done in other countries where it's not under
Yeah.
American jurisdiction.
Yeah.
So you can kind of think of them as like the government's personal mafia,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
All right, so from there, I have a little bit more Hoover. Hoover embraced the same blackmail techniques that he was himself subject to, and he kept secret files on numerous people in Washington and beyond, including Joseph McCarthy.
Hmm.
And he used this to gain favors and also protect his position as FBI director. So even if people knew that they could have taken him down by outing him, for example, he would be able to do the same back. So yeah, this mutually assured destruction type dynamic is on display
Mm-hmm.
here.
How long in total was Hoover FBI director? I mean, it was some ridiculous number.
It was a long time. Yeah.
Because it starts with like Prohibition era stuff, and then I think he's still there in the 60s and 70s,
Uh,
maybe. Like
Up
I
to the
don't remember.
60s. Yeah, I
Yeah,
have some stuff on Cohn and Hoover at Hoover's death. I don't
right.
think I have the date though. But
He was
yeah,
there a long time.
60 sounds right. Yeah,
Yeah,
and you can see why, right? Like
yeah.
he used it for his own personal power, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So we have a little bit of a change in location for these parties that Rosenstiel would organize, and they would have them at his home, but they would also have them at Suite 223 of the New York Plaza Hotel, which was known as the Blue Suite.
Right.
Now, this hotel was actually later purchased by Donald Trump in 1988.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just an interesting thing. Trump is known as Roy Cohn's protege, so there's like a little bit of like a lineage going on here.
Sure.
So, after Trump's purchase, we have the same kind of reports: young women and girls being introduced to older rich men, drugs, and girls being passed around. Yeah, so Rosenstiel was overheard telling Hoover, "Your wish is my command," in 1957. The two remained
Mm-hmm.
close throughout the 60s. Rosenstiel would make Hoover's right-hand man and longtime assistant at the FBI, Lewis Nichols. He made him the VP of his bourbon empire in 1957 and donated $1 million to the Hoover Foundation, which was also run by Nichols.
Mm.
Hoover was also close to a person running a sexual blackmail operation named Sherman Kaminsky. This was in New York, and it involved young male prostitutes. The operation was busted in 1966, and then after the FBI took it over, remember, Hoover's in charge of the FBI at this point, all the photos of Kaminsky and Hoover together disappeared from the case file. And we have more than one documented occasion of Hoover using blackmail to protect Rosenstiel and Roy Cohn, who was known as Rosenstiel's field commander. Yeah, so let's just take a second and summarize what we've put together here. So we have the Bronfman family sets up a bootlegging network that is, on one hand, legal in Canada, producing liquor legally, exporting it legally, but then it's distributed illegally inside the United States.
Mm-hmm.
One of the guys who worked for Bronfman, Rosensteel, goes on to form his own rival company to the Bronfmans and does so in a much more aggressive way and gets much more involved with organized crime, to the point that he's involving the FBI director in blackmail parties. Who I don't think I actually mentioned this, but at these parties you would see Frank Costello, Sam Giancana, Santo Trafficante, Angelo Bruno, Mayor Lansky, also Cardinal Spellman, who was a well-known pedophile priest. Yeah, so we have the Rosensteel sort of accelerating this whole operation of organized crime, creating blackmail on people of influence. And then Lansky working very intimately with U.S. military intelligence and the CIA, Israeli intelligence, in the pursuit of mutual interests, right? It's not just that he's like a stooge for the CIA or something, but he's willing to work with them where it fits what he already wants to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have the FBI director Hoover, who is operating the FBI in an extremely corrupt manner. I don't know how else to describe it. Just using it for his own personal privilege, basically. And he takes on this guy Roy Cohn as his. He really likes Roy Cohn, and you'll see why. So, Roy Cohn, who is that guy? He rose to power in the early 50s at the age of 23 and became a key figure in the Rosenberg trials, and later became the right-hand man for Joseph McCarthy. His dedication to anti-communism endeared him to Hoover. Cohn founded and led the American Jewish League Against Communism, and Hoover expressed admiration for Cohn's aggressive and manipulative tactics and told him to call me directly whenever he had information worth sharing. Hoover and Cohn thereafter traded favors, effusive compliments, gifts, and elaborate private dinners, and it quickly became Roy and Edgar. They were like an inseparable pair. And this is from a biography, or a book rather, called Bobby and J. Edgar by Burton Hirsch. By his own admission to the NYPD detective James Rothstein, Cohn hosted Rosensteel's parties at the Plaza Hotel, which is where that blue suite was located,
Mm-hmm.
and was involved in sexual blackmail operations targeting politicians with child prostitutes. To quote Rothstein, Cohn's job was to run the little boys. Say you had an admiral, a general, a congressman who did not want to go along with the program. Cohn's job was to set them up, and then they would go along. Cohn told me that himself. And this was also mentioned in John DeCamp's book on the Franklin scandal. And this operation, interestingly, was also used to fight communism. The whole anti-communist stuff was not like a cynical thing. Like, he was a very sincere anti-communist, did not like communism, and pursued those goals with his operations as well. There was a saying that attendees of his parties were said to have open accounts in Cohn's favor bank. Rosensteel and Cohn remained close until Rosensteel's death, when Cohn tried to trick him into naming him executor and trustee of his $74 million estate, which amounts to $334 million in today's dollars. The actual origins of Cohn and Rosensteel coming together is not as well known as Hoover and Cohn, but essentially what we have is Cohn coming up as a lawyer and working with Rosensteel and his mafia guys, probably somewhere through there, coming into contact with Hoover, and those two hitting it off, and then Cohn really jumping into the other world and not, I mean, still working very closely with the mafia, but being the guy on the other side that they could contact and work with. And then from the other end, people like Hoover, and later we'll see CIA directors and whatnot, could work with Cohn to make use of his mafia connections to get things that they wanted done. The best idea that we have about Cohn and Rosensteel coming together is that they were possibly connected through Roy's father, Albert, who was a prominent judge and influential figure in the New York City Democratic Party machine that was run by Edward Flynn. This organization had long-standing connections to organized crime, including Mayor Lansky. And when they looked into this, they said, we found wise guys just about everywhere we looked. So it seemed like he was mobbed up in his family already. Rosensteel was described as a father figure to Cohn. The men would salute each other in public. and they would refer to each other respectively as Supreme Commander and Field Commander. So Cohn became quite famous and influential because of the McCarthy trials, but he fell from grace as McCarthy's counsel when he was involved in a scandal attempting to blackmail the army in return for preferential treatment for a committee consultant and his rumored lover, David Schein. So after that, he went back to New York and was set up at a law firm called Sachs, Bacon, and O'Shea, which would later become Sachs, Bacon, and Bolin. And this was thanks to the New York judge David Peck, who was a longtime associate of the former CIA director Allen Dulles. So Cohn at this firm brought a slew of mafia-linked clients, including high-ranking members of the Gambino crime family, the Genovese crime family, and, of course, Rosenstiel. He was also involved in Studio 54, which there's a lot there, but I didn't really get into that too much. I thought that I had enough to say already. But Studio 54 was another one of these sort of setups where there was a lot of celebrities, powerful people partying it up, and it got involved in some cocaine dealing and embezzlement schemes, and Cohn represented the owners of the club when that happened. He died in 1986 due to AIDS-related complications, but denied to his very end that he had AIDS. He seemed to be ashamed of that and never wanted to admit the fact that he was bisexual or homosexual. That was something that he just outright rejected all the time. Friends of his include Donald Trump, Barbara Walters, who referred to him as her fiancé, former CIA directors such as Allen Dulles, Ronald and Nancy Reagan, Rupert Murdoch, Mort Zuckerman, very influential journalists such as Abe Rosenthal of the New York Times, William Safire, George Sokolsky of the Herald Tribune, who was also the head of the American Jewish League Against Communism alongside Cohn. Cy Newhouse Jr., who owned Vanity Fair, Vogue, GQ, and New Yorker, etc., etc. It goes on and on. Alan Dershowitz, top figures in the Catholic Church and Jewish organizations like B'nai B'rith and the World Jewish Congress, celebrities like Andy Warhol, Calvin Klein, Chuck Schumer. Oh, you'll like this one, guys. Margaret Trudeau, who was the mother of Justin Trudeau. And there's a famous story of her toppling his custom birthday cake. The reason I go through all of these names is that all of these names will appear in Epstein's Little Black Book. So Cohn set up this network and really built on what Rosenstiel and Hoover had established for themselves, and made it like if you were going to be anybody, you had to show up at these things because it was just the place to be, right? It's like there was this kernel there of the blackmail operations, but really what at this point, people just want to be there because it's like a socialite thing. You just want to be seen at these things.
Sure, yeah.
But, it's just very interesting and sinister,
That seems to be a trend kind of with most of these parties, is that a lot of the attendees will not really know why they're there, right? Like who the host is, other than he's famous, he's a fixer, he can get things done, like whatever that means. And those people will leave the party before the, main event starts, basically.
Yeah, so that's pretty much what I have on Cohn. I have a few quotes about whenever Roy wanted a story stopped, an item put in, or a story exploited, Roy called Murdoch. And then after Murdoch bought the New York Post, Cohn wielded the paper as his personal shiv. That's according to the New York Magazine. So he not only controlled people through blackmail and whatnot at this point, he was just calling in favors on people. And these people were the people that controlled media, that controlled culture, controlled money. At that point, you can kind of do what you want, I guess. So I don't know. Maybe that answers your question a little bit about individual power that you had earlier, Donald.
Yeah, I mean, it also kind of makes you feel like a rube or something. Do you know what I mean? Like, it just makes you feel like, you know what I mean? Like, it makes you feel like watching the news makes you just dumb or something. Like this idea that everything that most people talk about, like tax rates and all that kind of stuff, is just totally on the moon compared to what actually ends up running a lot of these things. Yeah, really, I don't know. That's what I always feel like after I kind of think about it for a while. I'm kind of like, I don't know, mainstream politics just ends up kind of seeming a little bit sillier. I don't know. I feel like there's
Yeah.
still, I mean, we'll get into this more in a bit, but I still think that there's some relationship, between the average person and some semblance of power kind of thing over certain things. Like, I think people can screw things up for the people in these positions sometimes. Like, and like, I think they can kind of rock the boat sometimes. And I just think that they haven't that often in the last, say, 50, 100 years in the United States. You know what I mean? Like, I think
Mhm.
a lot of other places, people get displaced, they get thrown out. New systems kind of take over, which are not necessarily better. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're worse. I do think that there's a danger to just get so focused on a specific network of people that you lose track of the structures around that can be changed or something like that. Yeah, that's what I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. I don't think you want to get too despairing or nihilistic when you start to realize the way things actually work, because
Yeah.
one thing that you'll see is that these people still can get in trouble.
Yeah.
And it's even fairly low level people that can do that. Just people who were at their parties. They can't control who comes there to a perfect degree. And they also
Hmm.
don't want to because they want it to be somewhat permeable and to be part of quote unquote like real society.
Yeah.
That's sort of part of why it's a powerful thing to do is because it's something you have some control over, but it's sort of like you can float it out there. But that means that it opens you up to being called out and to have these testimonies come out, and detectives can look into things and figure stuff out. There's still like institutional power, like the justice system and stuff, that no matter how much control they have over it, there is the possibility that even if they don't end up going to jail or something, that it'll mess up what they've been trying to do, you
Yeah.
know?
Or even rivals within the same networks, or mistakes within those networks or something like that.
Yeah,
Like,
definitely.
that's the other thing, is that because it's all premised on human frailty, that there's frailty within the systems that are being dominated. So there's a potential always for overthrow within those kind of mistakes and compromises within that system. So yeah.
Yeah, especially when these people are doing drugs and kind of like a
Yeah.
wild lifestyle, and they want to enjoy it. Like they're not clocking in and then going to work at the blackmail mines. You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
this is something that's like a party for them. It's not really work.
Yeah.
So stuff gets messed up pretty easily, I imagine. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's about where I end with my notes. I have stuff on the mega group, which I think we can talk about in a bit. Do you have stuff on Cone that you want, like maybe a connection from Cone to Epstein that you want to talk about, Mike?
I think you covered most of what's important about Cohn.
Okay.
Maybe I'll just add a couple of things that I noticed about his life. I mean, I thought Cohn was really fascinating because Whitney Webb's articles, which I recommend everyone read, use Cohn as this kind of bridge, right, between the Prohibition era mobsters, and it goes all the way into present times and the political figures that we're dealing with right now. So the couple of things that I want to talk about were, you mentioned that he graduated very early and immediately went to work. I mean,
Hmm.
even in just like the Wikipedia, it says he uses his family connections to be appointed to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Irving Sapol, who was the guy who was prosecuting the Smith Act prosecutions of Communist Party USA members, as well as you mentioned, the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg trial. So he's like 20 at that time, right?
Yeah.
Like in his service with McCarthy, I mean, he's no older than I think 25 or 26, like something like that. So
He's 23 when he gets appointed to McCarthy's council.
right. So, I mean, I think this characterization of him as like a sincere anti-communist ideologue is probably correct, right? It looks like he just beelined this,
Yeah.
and that's what he wanted to do, and that's what he spent his whole life doing, right? And he probably did see his activities with the CIA as a legitimate expression of that.
Yeah, as did Lansky.
Yeah.
So this anti-communism, I mean, it's obviously like a common goal for a lot of people, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if either of you know the impulses that drove these specific people. Like, I don't know. I just don't know even about, like, say, Hoover Was there some like was it like a libertarian, we need to defend freedom here, or what was like the impetus behind someone like Cohn? Like what was their ideology that they brought to it? Was it either sort of like a conservative religious background or just kind of like a money making defensive,
I mean, if you
like
look at Cohen, he's an upper class Yankee. He's a Jewish guy, but his early life is in Ivy prep schools, right? He goes to Columbia Law. He graduates at 20, right? Like this guy is definitely like an establishment guy. His father is an establishment guy, right? He's a New York Supreme Court judge, right? He's a fundraiser in the Democratic Party. So I think that probably plays into it. When I was looking at some of the documents around here, it's really interesting looking at the composition of the Jewish community in New York State at this time, right? Because you have a lot of different people from a lot of different places who get lumped into these like communal organizations and so on and so forth. And some of them are like really conservative German businessmen. And some of them are really radical, German communists, right? And people from all over the place. So I think, a lot of it just has to do with their background and their position in society more than anything else.
That's my impression too. I think there's also like in terms of like the mob guys being interested in anti-communism, I think there's if things changed structurally for them, that would mean that they would lose their position or they would have to radically adapt to new circumstances. So I think that's like a threat to their business, so to speak. But I also think that there is something. I didn't get any hard evidence about this, so this is just my impression. But I get the sense that for Hoover and for Lansky and for Cohn, anti-communism is something that is part of a kind of elitist sort of mentality that almost like a might makes right. We're doing the stuff that needs to get done to really obtain power. And all these losers out there that want to join together and stop that from happening, that goes totally against their mentality and their idea of like how the world works, so I think it's something ideological just on like a on like an ideological level.
And do you think that they're like being used by business groups as like a proxy for business, or is it widespread or deeper than that kind of thing where it's, you know what I mean? Like does business, what is like business's attitude towards it? Is they mostly ignorant of what's going on, or are they kind of funding these operations and kind of backing it?
So you mean like do businesses fund the blackmail parties?
No, I mean, like, is this kind of something like that's superimposed on the major corporations and things like that? Would they be, is this kind of parasitic on them, or is it a proxy from the business into these kind of networks to, I mean, because you talked about like the mob and things like that, but obviously it had to exist before this and to some extent, right? Like there had to be some, is this kind of like a special case you're talking about blackmail parties as a separate phenomenon? Or is this continuous thing of kind of like a ruling class mentality that, like, is this a parasitic new thing, or is it linked deeply to business over time? This is the current instantiation of, like, I'm not sure if that makes sense. Yeah.
You need photography for any of this to work, right? So this is technologically limited in some way. Like the specific form that it has is like historically limited in that sense anyway, right?
That makes sense.
Started even before photography with microphones.
Right, good point.
I do think that this was something that originates in the mob and then Hoover gets involved into it as a subject of it.
Yeah.
But also is willing to play along with these guys, and they kind of earn each other's trust, and then becomes not just a subject of it, but also someone who's utilizing it. And then it becomes part of the establishment intelligence apparatus. But what's interesting is that we have, like, Lansky working with the OSS predates that.
Sure.
So that's not the beginning of organized crime and intelligence working together. I don't know how far back that goes. That's not really where the research we did goes.
Sure.
But I think it's kind of both. Like, I think that this particular thing came from the mafia and went into the intelligence, if you want to call it that, into that scene. But I think that there's probably always been something that has this kind of function in elite society. Or at least in this sort of like historical period. Maybe it's changed over time I think there's something going on here. Like, this seems to be somehow emblematic of how power works in bourgeois circles.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I know what you mean then. Yeah. Okay.
So one thing that I wanted to mention about his anti-communist activities, it was interesting because, you know, the hammer really gets dropped on the communists after the war, right, on the American communists.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, you have this intense contrast with, in the 30s, this business plot, which is just kind of like swept under the rug, which appears to have been like an actual nascent coup attempt against FDR by members of the elite business community.
Yeah,
And
so let's just outline that real quick for people who may not be familiar. It was like Rockefeller and...
yeah, so it's interesting because the Communist Party was responsible for publishing the unredacted transcripts of the committee that was investigating the business plot. And those transcripts ended up implicating Felix Warburg, who is a major financier, and J.P. Morgan, and tying them to fascist organizations like the American Legion, the American Liberty League, Randolph Hearst's media empire. They were trying to get General MacArthur to lead the 500,000 man army against FDR, and they would be armed apparently by the Remington Company. This was the plan. So it's an interesting note. But, you know, that was just swept under the rug, and then, you know, the communists who exposed it were smashed after the war. So it's kind of an interesting side note that Cohn was involved with this. So the other things that I thought were interesting, you mentioned Cohn's Plaza Hotel parties that he takes over from Rosenstiel in 1958 in the Plaza Hotel. So Trump indeed picks up that hotel in 1988. And as you mentioned, he's running similar parties. And you see this again, like Donald Trump, he wants models, right? So he's involved in all the New York modeling agencies. He has his own modeling agency. The guy who basically invents the supermodel is John Casablancas. And Trump is very close friends with Casablancas and actually sends his daughter to be a model at age 14 with Casablancas, who's a known pedophile. So some very strange things happening in the Plaza Hotel. The Plaza Hotel later actually gets sold to a variety of elite Saudi and Israeli connected figures and firms, and is now owned by Qataris. So it's interesting how in the 70s and the 80s you start to see a lot of Middle Eastern and Pakistani money coming into this kind of stuff. And I'm not implicating them in anything necessarily, but, you know, this is real estate's all pretty dirty.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised, frankly.
Yeah. I thought, I wanted to really emphasize this. So he's talking to an NYPD detective, and he's straight up, I traffic kids to manipulate political figures, to the NYPD guy who's in charge of human trafficking investigations.
Yeah, I found that very strange, and I couldn't find an explanation.
He just comes out with it, right? This is what, and to me, this really says something about this guy, because he knows there's absolutely nothing that this guy can do. Nothing.
Yeah.
He can say it. It's the truth. That's what's going on. And the guy who's in charge of policing this can do nothing. I mean, it's chilling for me in some way. But...
yeah, it reminds me of the way Epstein handled certain things. You know, he would brag about having dirt on people and joke about being hired to kill people or all kinds of weird stuff. And, you know, just bragging to these teenage girls about how rich he is and stuff. Just really pathetic stuff.
Yeah, but, it's classic narcissist behavior in some ways.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. I think part of it, my impression is that part of that is that they don't want to have to bother with pretending. That's too much work. What they're if power means anything, it's got to at least mean that you don't have to try that hard. Your life shouldn't be hard. So
yeah, you're not going to skulk around in the dark. You know,
what would be the point, right?
Yeah.
If you want to be powerful, it's got to be you just live it up and don't care. So I think that's what a lot of the efforts here are to do, or to create ththose circumstances.
Yeah, and it does seem to be necessary with all of these things to have substantial media control to suppress this stuff, right? Because some of it is out in the open. So when you're talking about Murdoch, so there are a couple of interesting things about Murdoch. Murdoch actually ends up funding CIA PR campaign to basically improve the image of the dirty wars in Latin America, because Cohen introduces Murdoch to the Reagan fixers who need to get this done. So Cohen is, and I guess the repayment was helping Murdoch set up Fox News later on. So Cohen is very connected to that whole end of things as well. So speaking of the Reagan campaigns, Cohen is involved in both of those campaigns as a fixer. So he gets close to the Reagan network. In the first campaign, he hooks up with Roger Stone and Paul Manafort and introduces them to Trump. And his law partner, Tom Bolin, also acts as a fixer for the Reagans. And apparently was able, during the Reagan administration, to get friends of Cohen's family members appointed as federal judges. So Trump's sister, Marianne Trump Berry, is a federal judge, apparently on account of Cohen's law partner calling in some favors in the Reagan administration, which is pretty weird.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, it's strange. The Reagan administration also kind of connects Cohen to the Franklin scandal, maybe. So during this time, William Casey is calling Cohen daily, according to Christine Seymour, who is Cohen's switchboard operator. And this Seymour was going to release a book, sort of like tell-all about her time as Cohen's switchboard operator, and I believe was found like mysteriously dead, and all the notes for her book were missing. So that's one little tidbit that we got out, was that Casey was calling him every single day. That's William Casey's the director of the CIA during this time, right? So he doesn't have a lot of time to mess around. Like, he's dealing with Iran-Contra, and he's got other things on his plate. What is he talking about, right? And what is Cohen doing? Well, he's still running these blackmail operations, right? So as you mentioned, Reagan's mentor was Lew Wasserman. So he's a Hollywood mob guy. Then he was the president of MCA. And what did you say? Was it Seagram's that bought MCA?
Yeah, did they buy it?
Or made some kind of acquisition?
I didn't take down notes on exactly what was going on with MCA and Universal, but they were somehow working together in the 80s, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess MCA is understood to have had quite a bit of power in the Reagan administration as a result.
They made Reagan's movie career, and then they later made his political career.
Right.
And Wasserman is known to be like tied to the mob as well.
Yeah.
Apparently, like, had very firm control over Reagan while he was in office.
Yeah. Yeah. So the only other thing that I had on Cohen was that he was 2 months before he died, he was disbarred in New York State for basically just total bullshit. Like, they disbarred him for like not repaying a client loan, and like they had a couple other like minor instances of discreditable conduct. But it wasn't anything related to his like massive pedophile blackmail network, which is kind of amazing. But at that disbarment hearing, Alan Dershowitz, Barbara Walters, and Donald Trump showed up as his character witnesses.
Oh, yeah.
And Dershowitz, of course, was a character witness for Epstein as well. But yeah, they're all over the place. So the other stuff that I had from Webb's articles, it's worth just noting that Webb, she talks about another sort of similar CIA fixer type, Robert Keith Gray, who seems to have been more of a finance guy and less of a blackmail guy. And he was the former chairman and CEO of a Washington-based PR firm, Hill and Knowlton, which I believe is still quite powerful.
Yeah. Yep.
She goes over Craig Spence, which we talked about last time, the similarities between Spence's operation and Epstein's operation. And she talks about Larry King as well. But the point of this is that, to maybe Donald's point about not getting too focused on one aspect of this network, it's clear that there were multiple operations occurring at the same time. And the Reagan administration is when we have the most visibility on this, right? Like, you have Cohen in operation, you have Spence in operation, you have Larry King in operation. Those are probably all separate rings. You have this Robert Keith Gray guy in operation, right? So these guys are all going parallel, and they all have different subsets of different communities that they're catering to.
Yeah. And Iran Contra.
Right. So why don't we get into that a little bit? I mean, I think one of the most interesting connections here is to the Promise scandal or the Inslaw affair, which was a Reagan era scandal, which occurred while all of these blackmail fixers that we now know a fair amount about were operating. So the Inslaw affair starts with the Institute for Law and Social Research, which later becomes Inslaw. So this institute was founded in 1973 by this guy, William Hamilton, who I believe is an NSA veteran. And this was a publicly funded institute to develop law office automation software, right? So it's basically database software intended to make things easier for law enforcement and lawyers and DAs and this kind of thing. So it's originally called the Prosecutors Management Information System, or PROMIS, and it was originally developed as a COBOL program basically to link mainframe databases. So these are like large room-sized computers. Because it was funded by the government, that COBOL program was actually public domain. I was unable to locate the code. I don't know if anyone has a copy or knows what's in there, but it's not really clear what the capabilities of the code were. But it enabled something like the searching of institutional databases worldwide on a semi-automated basis for, let's say you give it a name and it'll just search all the records it can find in all of the law offices and all of the databases that it's connected to for that name and like people who are related and other kinds of things that can be inferred. So this is a very early kind of version of our later spy software, PRISM type software that we see with the NSA. By all accounts, this software was pretty darn good. The Department of Justice experiments with it in 1979, likes it a lot, but they want a version for 16-bit mini computers. So this is before the PC. Basically, the step between the mainframe and the PC is a mini computer, which is kind of like a cabinet-sized computer. They actually didn't have any 16-bit mini computers at that time. They were just in the process of acquiring them. There seems to be all kinds of management problems associated with this contract. But this William Hamilton guy, the guy who founded the institute, he goes private. He's awarded the tender to develop this 16-bit system as the company Inslaw. So there are all kinds of contract disputes which ensue, and Inslaw goes bankrupt in 1985. And at some point during this process, the Department of Justice appears to have made the decision to develop a clone internally, probably arising from these contract disputes. So Hamilton pursues the Department of Justice in court and manages to start a large sort of process of inquiries up to the level of the Attorney General, and a special counsel being appointed by the Attorney General of the United States. And basically at every stage, the DOJ stonewalls. Ultimately, the Attorney General's special counsel report comes down on the side of the government, attacks Hamilton's credibility, and basically says the new version of the software that the Department of Justice developed internally is materially different from the other 16-bit version developed by Inslaw. And the COBOL version is in the public domain anyway, so screw you, basically. Like, you have no claims over us. The software is ours. The Attorney General who appointed the special counsel was William Barr.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, boy.
So interesting. The Department of Justice seems to have some point have handed the software off to the CIA. So it has obvious intelligence uses and implications, right? So they have it re-engineered apparently by a guy named Michael Riconosciuto at a company called Wackenhut Corp. For the purposes of having a backdoor installed into the software. That information comes from an investigation by an independent journalist, Danny Casolaro, who, after telling his family that he was onto a major government plot, committed suicide after telling his family that he would not commit suicide and that if he did, it was going to be because he was assassinated. So that's where that came from. So the CIA version seems to have failed internationally. Basically, they were trying to use this to just sell this software to anyone who would take it and get a CIA backdoor on their systems. With the exception of the Canadians who, you know, being the polite gentlemen that we are, we bought a copy and installed it. The RCMP ended up mounting an investigation into this and seems to have gotten waved off by the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point, Israeli intelligence got a copy, had their own backdoor installed, and that was given to Robert Maxwell, who sold this stuff extensively in Eastern Europe, Russia, all over the place globally. And this apparently gave Mossad just unprecedented access to computer networks for many years until the backdoor was discovered and people understood what this software actually was. So one of the really notable and interesting things about the spread of this software is that in addition to Maxwell, the software seems to have been distributed by the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which was another major Reagan era scandal. And
is this the famous BCCI?
Correct. This is BCCI. Okay. So they seem to have used, I think, the Israeli version of this software and sold it to other banks. So they probably had backdoors into all kinds of banks in the 80s and 90s. So BCCI was a private bank. It was founded by a Pakistani financier, came embroiled in just an enormous money laundering scandal or series of scandals in the 80s. They were prosecuted in both the US and the UK for all kinds of financial transgressions.
Yeah, didn't it turn out that it was basically entirely like 99% money laundering? Like there was almost nothing legitimate about it?
From what I read, they had like no meaningful record keeping.
Yeah.
Like it was a bank with no accounts. Yeah.
And
or no account keeping anyways. Yeah, and a lot of money. So the National Security Council is known to have done business with BCCI to launder money in the Iran-Contra scandal. They were also laundering for Saddam Hussein, Noriega, the Medellin cartel, etc. And Robert Mueller was the Assistant Attorney General at the time and oversaw the prosecution of BCCI. So it's interesting.
Okay, I just looked it up. $20 billion, making it the 7th largest private bank in the world after a decade after it opened.
Yeah. Enormous monetary flows, and virtually all of it criminal. Yeah.
Wow.
And Adnan Khashoggi was a key BCCI Iran-Contra middleman. So Jamal Khashoggi is his nephew, which is kind of an interesting aside.
Yeah, I haven't really investigated that whole thing. You know,
I don't know if it means anything at all, to be honest.
Right, because that's the thing. It's probably a big family.
Yeah.
But yeah, I thought it was neat. Anyway, so while this is all going on, Bill Clinton is the governor of Arkansas, and allegedly at the time, the Mena, Arkansas drug running operation is being operated by the CIA in order to fund, at least in part, the Iran-Contra stuff and other things that they were doing. And part of the conspiracy lore around the Clintons for years and years has been this stuff about Mena, Arkansas. And I believe there's actually a Hollywood movie about it, which is kind of strange. Hillary is also apparently involved. I haven't been able to track this down, any documentary confirmation, but allegedly she represented, while she was a lawyer at the time, a banking software contractor called Systematics that was marketing BCCI's version of Promise. So many of these same actors, Jeffrey Epstein included, go on to set up the Clinton Global Initiative Foundation. So Jeffrey Epstein actually claims to have been a founding member of the Clinton Global Initiative, which is interesting.
Yeah, right.
And this all kind of dovetails back into Epstein here, because Epstein appears to have inherited not only the sexual blackmail activities of Cohn, but he's also the founder with Ehud Barak of this company Carbine, which is straight Israeli intelligence as far as anyone can figure. And they're selling something like Promise. So it's some kind of software that hooks up like 9/11 law enforcement systems and all their cameras and all of these kinds of things so that they can all be networked and presumably looked at by Mossad. So overall, Epstein appears to just inherit everything. Like he didn't set any of this up, right? Like it all, there's quite a bit of continuity from the Reagans into first Bush, into Clinton, into second Bush, right? So it's pretty interesting in that regard.
I guess this is where it becomes a question. So on Chapo, I had mentioned to you earlier, but on Chapo, they went a bit and one of the kind of things he said was that if Epstein could be taken down, like he was, it must have meant at some level that they were confident that he didn't actually have the ability to blackmail people around him, because all of that would be in place with him dying. Like, you know what I mean? There'd be like a dead man switch kind of thing.
Right.
You
I
know,
see what
and
you're saying.
so anyways, the point being is that might mean that he's like a cutout, and then so he might inherit all of these things on paper and might have kind of like a role within that, but it's much more a network than it is an individual that runs it. It's more
Oh
kind of
yeah,
like, I think
That
yeah.
that
I think
makes
that's
sense.
interesting.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, no, Epstein for me is just a face, right? Like what I
yeah.
think last episode I said he's like a trained dog for me. They put him down like a dog, right? Like that's what he is. He's not the most important figure by any means.
Yeah, which is a little bit of a difference from Cohn.
Yeah.
Cohn seemed to be more of a character. I think what we start to see is almost like it's interesting. It's almost like a institutionalization of these things where
Yeah.
you just you're a monkey pulling a lever. You're not the guy that invented it all and has to manage it all personally. It's
Yeah.
all set up and now you just push the buttons.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I don't think that Epstein is particularly, and that's why it doesn't matter that he's dead, right? Like his brother is probably still running ops that are just like this at the huge apartment building that they own, right? Like they're
Yeah.
interchangeable.
Yeah, there does seem to be a lot of overlap with his brother and him in terms of their business, quote unquote business
Yeah.
Yeah.
stuff that's going on, but it's also said that he's like an estranged brother. So, that's obviously could be a cover
Where did
story,
that
but
come from? I mean, I
I don't
started
know. I
seeing
just
that
see it.
almost immediately that it's his estranged brother. Well, how do you
Yeah,
know
okay.
who has interviewed Mark Epstein about Jeffrey Epstein? I've never seen that.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it will be interesting to see what happens with his brother.
Yeah.
I had this idea that while you were describing Carbine and Promise and stuff, that it's very similar to the blackmail parties in a certain way, like in the function it performs.
Yeah.
That it just collects this information and stuff, and it's just interesting to see it in these different periods of time based on the technology and the way that power circulates, the way that that information collection occurs, and that I wonder, like in that earlier period, we sort of see this thing where it's like you get the power, but you're also subject to it. You're subject to the same mechanisms. They can blackmail you just as easily as you can blackmail other people. I wonder how much that's the case with big data style information gathering. It doesn't seem to be about getting information on individuals. Like that seems to be still done in the same old school way with Epstein and his pedophilia stuff.
I think that's the elite stuff, and then the NSA type dragnet where they're getting all your, porn searches and stuff. That's like the blackmail for the little people, right? When you inevitably end up converting to Islam and going through your radical phase, they're gonna come after you, like, we have all this information about you, and if you don't, give us information about your friends in Saudi Arabia, then we're gonna give it to your mom, right?
I will never give up my Saudi brother.
So, but I mean, I think like the Epstein stuff is like bespoke blackmail, right? Like that's for like the absolute upper crust.
Mm-hmm.
But the general intelligence community operates on this stuff, right? Like that's what they're collecting when they're
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the big data is almost population control
yeah.
type. Yeah. It's
I think
interesting.
that's it. One of the fascinating things to me now is that it's clear that they can't stop some of the disclosure of this, and there are at least a couple of identifiable disinformation operations happening on the internet right now, right? Like one of them is QAnon, obviously. That's the most famous one. But I mean, like if you think about what's happening with QAnon, it's really interesting, right? Because it's like they're targeting the most vulnerable, low information boomers who are deeply invested in the concept of America as like the good guys, and the government and the military and intelligence is fundamentally like, they're doing dirty stuff, but you have to do dirty stuff to fight the terrorists. And
it's like cop show mythology.
Yeah, right. And so QAnon is like mainlining them with a certain version of this that's like highly sanitized and that allows them to maintain this vision without actually grasping the overall picture that, like, Trump is absolutely part of this network, right? And that the Republican Democrat thing that has been going on for so long, at least since Reagan, has just been a myth, right? Like, it's the same people. There's no American politics since Reagan. Party politics have been controlled by this network, as far as I can figure, right? So it seems to me that this information is dangerous, right? The other guy that I am quite sure is an intelligence disinfo guy is George Webb, who's on YouTube, and he's been talking a lot about this stuff. By his own account, he's a Mossad guy. He's connected to Mossad. So it seems like, QAnon is probably some element of US intelligence or some element of this network. And maybe George Webb is like a Mossad guy. And they're kind of like, they're trying to deliver massaged narratives about certain aspects of this that highlight certain actors and downplay other actors. And I think it's to the point now where they realize that it's inevitable that some of this is going to come out. And the question is, how do we kind of like manage the fallout of this?
Yeah. I mean, that's a smart way to do it. The dumb way to do it is what it seems like the liberal-leaning media is doing, which is to try to just say, oh, it's all conspiracy theory, just, ignore it. Like, no one's buying the official stories on any of this stuff. So that's,
Yeah,
you're just implicating yourself when you try to play along with that. Like, you need to get away from it and craft your own spin on it. If I don't know. I don't really understand why that is, and I don't want to think that it's just they're dumb. There must be a reason why they're trying to maintain that dumb of a cover story for it, and it's got to be something like, well, it's better to just say that and to force people to work through it themselves and to come up with these like malformed explanations of things than to admit to anything other than just to anything at all. They're just basically not allowing admittance of anything. So yeah, it's weird. On the other side though, like, we can easily criticize QAnon. I think that's a easy target. I think with the way that a lot of this stuff has gone mainstream, especially with the kind of crowds that, like people we know and our friends and that kind of thing, people just accepting a lot of this stuff. I see people doing a similar sort of move on our side. So like the kind of lefty Bernie Sanders-y type people. It seems like the narratives that we had before accepting any of this information is still the narrative that is playing out with this information plugged in. And so what you're getting is, oh, it's all CIA, or it's all like a Gladio thing. And I don't even think that those are incorrect statements, but I think if you focus too narrowly on those particular things and don't allow this to kind of change fundamentally the way you look at how power operates, you're not really getting it. You're promulgating the same misconceptions or the same kind of narrow view that you had prior, and
Sure.
you're just
Yeah.
plugging this information that could really open things up. And so what I'm very interested in for this stuff is to think about power in a different way. And what I keep thinking about lately is there's this phrase that keeps running through my head, and it's like the state doesn't exist or the government doesn't exist. Like, to me at this point, the government is like the post office and the library. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like, it doesn't really, like, obviously it has some authority and some power, and like we were saying, like, these guys can easily get entrapped within those things, and there's a reason that they actually pursue these various positions of power and that it means something to them. Like, it's not just about status. I think there is actual material uses for the institutional powers and stuff, but I tend to think these days that sovereignty doesn't really sit in the executive office or even at the heads of companies and stuff. I think that's less. If we look at it that way, we're fetishizing things a little bit. I think looking at things in terms of this network is really where power sits, and it really operates on like a layer above all of these institutions and establishments, so that you can't just like seize control of like the government and then be good. You know,
Mhm.
like what is that going to do for these guys? They own everything already in like a real way, like they own it, like they have possession of it.
Yeah.
So if you take control of the government, or like, you know, if you get your most radical person you can think of and put them in the presidential office, like, so what? You know, they took out JFK and nobody got caught for that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. It's yeah, I mean, it's funny in some ways because a lot of the narrative seems to, like you see a lot of intense focus on stuff like the Democratic primary, and I think that's fine. Like, I think it's fine to follow it as like a horse race kind of thing.
Yeah, it is what it is, right?
It is what it is, and it might actually have, as I said, like it does have some relationship to what the government ends up doing, maybe. But that is all. I think it's also true that like someone like Bernie Sanders getting in to a position like that, I think it does change certain aspects of how the government operates and maybe
Yeah, for
potential
sure.
threats to that thing. But
Yeah.
to
Like, for
focus that,
example,
yeah,
like when they controlled Reagan, they wanted to control the president. That tells you
yeah,
that the president, who the president is and what decisions he makes, actually means something. It's not
sure,
totally theater.
sure.
So
But to think that that's gonna, it's focusing on that as the precondition for other things allows you to salvage the old model of politics in your mind, kind of
yeah,
Right.
thing. Like to
exactly.
kind of, so to say that like, well, if he's going to be the one that disrupts this system in some way, then that's still the basic model that we have to work with and not have to worry about. There's much more. It's funny because it's bleak in some ways, but I feel like, I don't know, maybe I've just always had this kind of impulse, at least for like 10 years or so, that like the closer you get to what's actually happening is much more productive for you politically. And therefore, it's not like a bleak thing to accept that something is worse than you thought it was, because it means that you've kind of escaped from a potential trap in that one situation, right? Like,
Sure.
Yes,
so I
absolutely.
so
Yeah.
I think that's a big thing too, is that because people ask me, I honestly I do feel, I mean, you guys might disagree with me with this, but I do feel optimistic in some certain ways about certain changes that might happen in the future, or at least like I think it's a potential outcome, you know. But I feel like I already went through my phase years ago where I realized how bad it was to a pretty big extent.
Mm.
You know, I've kind of bounced back and forth since then, but I feel like I've already, I don't know, I almost have like a nostalgic, like strange feeling seeing people kind of dive into very negative stuff, because for me it was like the Iraq war kind of stuff, just
Yeah.
like the constant every day, major attacks really, really like warped my mind on this kind of stuff, like where I was just like, because seeing people treat it as just like a political issue, as if it was like points and statistics and stuff,
Yeah.
when you kind of realize that it's like huge effects on people's lives and stuff, like that really kind of, I don't know, it was almost like everything else after that was almost like a secondary issue to the kind of like systems that were being controlled and exploited for bizarre reasons. And so it's kind of funny now, I see a lot of people talking in kind of like the highest, excited tones, and it's like, yeah, but you have to kind of strap in and get ready for a lot more after that kind of thing. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel very similarly. I think I've always sort of been like
Yeah.
black pilled from birth or
Sure.
something. I
Yeah.
feel like a lot of my experience of when I was younger was like trying to catch up with the awful reality that was already confronting me. I think just growing up with my dad being the way he was, very cynical and never really, just anytime I expressed any kind of like naive sort of like ideas about the way the world works, he would just really give it to me straight.
Yeah. 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 Well,
And
yeah.
just, seeing the kind of poverty in the third world, it was like
Sure.
very
Oh, yeah,
hard
yeah, yeah.
to like accept certain narratives and stuff.
So it's funny because I would say from like 14, 15, 16 years old, I was like broadly reformist, kind of left. I was kind of interested in, I was actually, I mean, it's kind of funny in retrospect, but I was like mailing away to learn about like what democratic socialism was and all that kind of stuff, right? Like I was kind of interested in that kind of stuff. And I had a very, and then, for a few years, I kind of went like veered right from there. And it was because I think in some terms, I had a very, very typical situation where, I grew up in what's called the 905 in this area. It's like the belt around Toronto. which is mostly kind of like, middle class, working class, like, but it's like nice homes and tends to vote conservative or like liberal that is like sort of like right leaning. And so it was almost like it could have very easily, if I didn't have certain kind of like predispositions in terms of mental health and things like that. It's kind of funny. Like I feel like I'm almost the opposite case where I'm someone that could have ended up a policy analyst in Ottawa and was pretty much on that track. And it was sort of like mental health and things that kind of compounded with kind of like looking at the world and being totally blown away by what I saw. So I don't know. I feel like that's kind of an interesting kind of contrast where for me, I always feel like looking back, even a few years, I always go, oh man, what was I thinking? So yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, for me, I don't feel very close about this. I mean, like, this really focuses our minds. We talked previously about climate change and, do we expect anything from politics? And, I mean, if you're going to be mature about what you can expect from politics, you have to get some sense of what the stakes are, who's involved, and what their methods are, right? And if this is what you're up against, I mean, you have to prepare for that, right? Like, these are people who are happy to kill on a whim, more or less, right? They feel like you're getting too close to something, you're gone, right? So, we have to understand this to even start to think like in a holistic, mature way about what would a politics that actually worked look like.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, what do we have to lose? Like, what we don't have anything going on. Like, what is the problem? Let's just like, if this makes us have to reconsider everything and start afresh, well, good. Then we have some place to start at least.
Yeah, sure.
You know?
Yep.
Yeah, so I honestly like feel good about this stuff. I mean, it's been something that I sort of have been able to digest for a couple of years now. So, on one hand, it is fun to see people kind of go through this, and it's a very strange feeling to watch this be mainstream.
Yeah.
To the point where I was able to talk about this stuff in detail with Tab's dad the other day.
Wow.
Like, after grilling, he knew all the ins and outs and everything. I mean, he kind of he's a very like lib Democrat type of guy, Russia Gator, all that. So he has this idea like, doesn't this really sound like the Russian mob? And I'm like, well, yeah, because it's probably the same people running both countries, dude. But it's a very strange thing. I'm still getting used to that because this was something that, when it exists in that conspiracy theory world on these weirdo websites, and you're reading like you're watching some retard's YouTube video, and you're like, well, there's some information here that's good, but this guy's obviously like a moron.
Yeah.
You just feel weird about it. Like, you kind of feel like you're LARPing yourself and you're memeing yourself a little bit.
Yeah.
I felt like I was crazy when I first started getting into this stuff. Like when I found like the documentation on the Finder's Call and the Franklin scandal, like I was freaking out. Like I was routinely having nightmares and stuff. I think we were talking about this before the show. I really have to maintain like some level of like maybe ironic detachment and also like a sort of clinical detachment, especially from the stuff about the child abuse.
Yeah.
Like that stuff will go right into your head. So if you're thinking about this a lot, it's gonna be disturbing at first, but after a while, it's kind of like, well, it's happening, right? So we have to figure out what's going on at least.
I mean, we don't have to. Like, it doesn't matter what we. I think for anyone listening to this, if you feel really despairing about this kind of stuff, where you feel like you just can't handle it, you don't have to. It's not going to matter if you know this information or not. I think whether you know this information and you're trying to make something of it, or whether you're not, you basically have the same obligations to the people around you in your community anyways. Like, just be a decent person, do whatever you can at your job that's like a decent occupation. Be good to your family. If you have a family, just raise good kids, give them good moral. Like, that's all you got to be doing, really. Like, it's not your obligation to
but if you're called, then you got to figure it
out. Yeah, I mean, if it does spark your interest, and obviously we're people that it does, and I think a lot of more people seem to be interested in this as of late. then you need to, yeah, you do really need to make sure that you're checking yourself a bit. Like, take it slow. It's a lot to digest. There's a lot of stupid information, theories, and all that kind of stuff out there. I'm seeing people, talking about like, oh, they faked the body and stuff. Like, please don't just relax a little bit. It's exciting. I understand that, but you really want to approach this being as conservative as possible. Even if something seems very clearly to point in a certain direction, you have to be very aware of what your assumptions are and what the kind of assumptions you're making based on things, and know that one piece of information next to another piece of information can look very much like they're connected and very much like it implies a certain thing. But if you have that third piece of information, it could destroy all of those assumptions. And we're getting probably just the tip of the iceberg of what's actually out there. So you really just need to stick very, very closely to what's well documented, and that should really be enough.
It is enough. I mean, like, if you go read those Whitney Webb articles, you will have a good sense, I think. I mean, for me, when I was reading that, I was just like amazed, right? Because I had all these little bits and pieces, the Reagan era scandals and some of the more recent stuff, and then it was like this massive bridge drawn all the way through that material with Punk. And I really feel like this is a credible historical narrative that makes some sense of, the way that I look at it kind of is, how do you run an empire in a democracy that's structured like the US?
Right.
And, initially, like with the business plot and stuff, you have the elites kind of going, well, maybe this Hitler guy has the right idea. Maybe it's this like kind of overt totalitarianism. And then the war kind of makes that impossible, but they come home with all of these intelligence tools, right? And the mob associations and these kinds of things. And then you get the formation sort of like the inverted totalitarianism that we have now through these kinds of mechanisms, right? And I think what you were saying about network thinking and stuff, I mean, it's almost like a Thousand Plateaus thing, right? Like, this is all about like the management of libido of the elites, blackmail, and all of this kind of. It's about this kind of like network of desire management, even, and that's how you achieve sort of like imperial Gleichschaltung in a state like the U.S., where that's actually pretty hard.
Yeah. So I hope that this has been useful to people. I know it's a little bit of an overload. We tried to put it together in a way that's like a coherent story. Donald, you seem to be able to follow what we were saying. So
yeah.
So I think there's a narrative here. I would also urge you guys to go read the Whitney Webb articles that we pulled most of this information from. Re-listen to this. I think my intention with making this was that we would have a kind of zoomed out big picture for people to plug this information that they're getting from the news and from various sources into something so they can make sense of it, so it doesn't just kind of disperse into these fragmented, narrow political paradigms that I really don't think fit, and they haven't fit for a long time. And this is a good opportunity to relook at things. And Mike, you mentioned that, maybe this is the way that empire needs to run in a democratic looking system. Well, that empire is probably on its way to collapse, or at least weakening at this point. So that may be one reason why this is coming to light and why things are sort of coming apart at the seams for these guys.
Sure.
So if that's the case, it would be really great if we could jump on that and get people a little bit more bit of that sovereignty than we've had for a while. So that would be a really ideal thing, but it means you kind of have to look at things in a different way than we have been. There's a lot of questions that people have sent in, like maybe a dozen or so. Do you guys want to do that maybe on a separate episode?
Yeah, maybe we could do it. I think we should wrap up for now, and then I think people will have questions about this too. So I'm not sure how you want to do that, but yeah.
Man, we didn't even get into the mega group stuff, eh? Like,
I know we kind of set it all up and then left it there. But I mean, I think we accomplished what I wanted to accomplish.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for coming back on, Professor Pizzagate.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Illuminating.
Yeah. Lots of fun to talk about this stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I just had fun doing the research. it helped me kind of sort through a lot of stuff and trying to build like some kind of coherent narrative out of all these little bits and pieces it's good. It's useful. You know,
I think it's becoming possible now, right? Like we can really kind of see what's going on over a couple of decades, and it's not just like, well, there were a couple of bad apples in the CIA, and then there were a couple of more, and there were a couple of more, right? Like, it's the same guys.
Yeah, and I mean, I even think that just trying to write off things as like some kind of structural explanation, where it's like, oh well, it's because of capitalism, or it's because of you know, whatever kind of explanation like that. That's just as useless. You know, we kind of do need to get in the weeds a little bit.
Yeah.
But we need to do that for the purposes of building up some kind of bigger narrative.
Yeah.
Not just get stuck in those weeds.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so thanks for listening, guys. If you have questions, as I'm sure there will be some questions at least, send them to our Curious Cat. You can find that at the Twitter at YouCan'tWinPod. It's a pinned tweet there. And thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks, guys.